Crowd control is a really important part of Arknights, but it can be hard for units focused on it to break into the popular meta. Even many of the crowd control ops most people regard as good, like Suzerain, are still only things you bust out for really difficult content, where your go-to DPS units aren't enough on their own. And even then, Suzu's damage amp gets a lot more attention than her slow. Usually, when it comes time to plan out your polls, it's the DPS units that get priority, and the crowd control ops that get pushed to the maybe if I get really lucky, or the could be a cool off banner piles. And it's not hard to see why. I mean, DPS is important to have. Stalling enemies out can be hugely helpful, but you still have to kill them somehow. And it's hard for a unit whose job it is to set up other units to be a meta-defining carry. Plus, it's mostly just in hardcore content like CC where the usual DPS options aren't enough on their own. And besides, it's just much easier to convey what makes a DPS unit strong than what makes a similarly powerful crowd control unit strong. While they have a lot going on besides their damage, you don't ever really have to prove why units like Wishadel and Exualt are strong. They just do the most damage, so of course they are. But meanwhile, very good crowd control units like Ascalon still often have to prove the doubters wrong. But Tragodia has broken that trend. As if despite the haters of his non-alter form, it's a pretty solid consensus at this point that he's a top 3 unit in the game. And as a stall unit, that's a big deal. But because he's so good, he can also tell us a lot about crowd control in Arknights, how it works, and why it can be so valuable. And by understanding that, it can completely change how you look at DPS. Tragodia is our second 6-star ritualist after the limited Virtuosa, but he has a bit of a different approach to it. Ritualists are ranged units that can deal elemental buildup without having that reduced by res or defense. And Virtuosa takes advantage of that by having wildly fast application and incredibly high status uptime, even on multiple targets, and focuses on dealing as much elemental damage as possible, something that works really well for her considering that Necrosis deals the most damage of any elemental status, even before you factor in the ways her talent and mod can increase that. But Nervous Impairment, Tragodia's status, is a bit different. While it deals half as much damage as Necrosis, making it the lowest among all friendly elemental damage types so far, it makes up for that with much greater utility, applying 3 stacks of a new paralysis status to the enemy, with each stack preventing the enemy from dealing 1 normal attack. Now, it is just for normal attacks, but the more you get into it, you start to discover that a lot of bosses or elites have skills that are tied to doing a certain number of regular attacks. If they don't do those regular attacks, they don't get to do their skills. This is absolutely busted, and honestly, easily beats out even the 20 res debuff that Burn applies in terms of pure utility, and Tragodia leads into this a lot in his kit. His first talent lets all of his attacks deal nervous impairment buildup as a percentage of his attack, while dealing slightly less buildup in an AoE around his main target. This is his bread and butter and the core of how he applies his status, though his second talent builds on this as well, applying a small amount of additional buildup to enemies whenever they try to make an attack within his range. But that's not all that his second talent does. It has an additional effect as well, reducing enemies' attack speed when under the effect of the nervous impairment status. This works incredibly well with the paralysis debuff his status applies. Because paralysis stacks specifically prevent 1 regular attack each, they work best with enemies that have slow attack intervals. An enemy that takes 3 seconds to attack will take 9 seconds to go through 3 stacks, whereas an enemy that attacks once every second will burn through them in only 3 seconds. This attack speed reduction makes sure that every enemy that gets the status takes even longer to burn through their 3 stacks, taking an already very valuable status and making it even better. This is also the talent that gets upgraded by his mod, though the numbers for it aren't like Viviana Delta mod levels or anything. Fortunately, the Ritualist X mod trait change is very good, noticeably boosting his elemental application to elites and bosses. The talent changes also improve both the attack speed reduction and the nervous impairment infliction when enemies try to attack. While the numbers he gets from the talent changes don't necessarily revolutionize how this talent works, it's on a talent that's good enough that I'd still recommend building the mod, especially when you should definitely be building the base mod for the trait change anyway. His first skill is maybe the only part of his kit that you don't really need to worry about. On a short offensive recovery SP cost, the next attack will deal 2 hits of arts damage as a portion of his attack, bind the enemy, and deal extra nervous impairment to the enemies bound specifically by his skill. It's fine and honestly pretty good for a 6-star S1, but the other skills are just way too good to leave this one with all that much space to play. The only real reason you'd use it is for the fact that it's AFK, so it's more of a nice to have than a need to have. That said, masteries are pretty solid for it, especially as his M3 reduces the SP cost from 3 to 2, and lets him drop with a skill already charged. Not to mention the damage and elemental application boosts. So if you're going to use it, think about masteries, but only after finishing up his other 2 skills. His second skill is not only one of the best skills in the game, but also one of the funniest. It's an infinite duration skill on a 25 SP charge, though don't let the infinite duration fact trick you into thinking it's AFK. Once charged, he gains attack speed and a larger splash radius. This is already a nice little bonus, but the real reason to use this skill is the fact that it lets him deploy a little kitty cat anywhere on the map that will attract up to 4 enemies around it for 10 seconds, even prioritizing elites and bosses. When they reach it, it'll explode, inflicting slow, arts damage, and nervous impairment buildup for a duration. This skill is very funny. There's something beautiful about seeing the biggest and baddest enemies in all of Terra wandering away in search of a kitty cat, but it's also unbelievably busted. I think by now people are fairly familiar with Nymph and how good her S2 is for stalling. Now imagine that, but with global range, where you don't have to worry about making sure he's targeting the right enemy, and you can control specifically where they're heading. And oh yeah, if they do hit a blocker, the nervous impairment specifically makes it so that they won't even be able to attack them. This is really, 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 really strong. And at M3, it has only a 25 SP cost, which is also wild. The summon does also have a 25-second redeploy timer, so you will have some time where the enemy is not chasing it or slowed, but with just a bit of extra crowd control, you can have enemies just permanently chasing this thing across the map. Groups of them, anywhere. I just can't say all of that enough. You really, really want this skill on him. And this skill alone would make him an incredible unit. But he also has another skill that somehow also still gets used. His S3 expands his range, actually to the same range as Virtuosa S3, if you're familiar with her. It increases his attack and makes his attack prioritize enemies not already under the elemental burst. And any enemy that he attacks will receive 10% of his attack as nervous impairment buildup per second, every second, until the skill ends. Enemies will also run through their status much more quickly, and when it triggers, they'll have this cage thing spawn beneath them, blocking all enemies on the tile and only breaking once they take 3 hits from the blocked enemies, 30 seconds after the skill ends, or all the enemies on the tile just die. Now, this skill has a lot going on. First of all, extra attack and the build-up DOT are great for letting him spread the status. And the fact that his priority shifts away from the enemies already under the status makes sure that those effects are spread as wide as possible. Additionally, the things that spawn and block them keep those enemies locked in place, while the paralysis and his attack speed debuff keep enemies from destroying them. Plus, the elemental status clearing much more quickly is also perfect for nervous impairment, and especially for this skill. All 3 of the friendly elemental damage types carry a debuff along with their status, but nervous impairment is the only one where that debuff is not tied to the duration of the elemental status. This means that even though the status runs through more quickly here, there's literally no downside. They still carry all possible stacks of paralysis, and can have them refresh sooner. Plus, because the nervous impairment deals all of its damage immediately upon triggering the status, it greatly increases his elemental damage output as well. A nice bonus considering that nervous impairment deals the least damage of any of the 3 friendly elemental damage types. All of this comes together to create an absolutely busted S3. And with surprisingly little help, he can just permanently lock down a bunch of enemies, keeping them from moving and attacking just forever. Like, there's a reason this gets used even with his S2 being that strong. So yeah, M6 your Tragodia. And that's his kit. He's a really strong stall unit, but there are lots of good stall units in the game that people tend to ignore. So why is everyone freaking out about him being busted but kind of ignoring the others? What separates him from other stall units, and how can a stall unit even be good in a game with Wishadel and Exuwalt? The key to why Tragodia is so good, and the real strength of any stall unit, is in how we define DPS. While typically people tend to solve DPS checks by increasing the damage, that's only half of the equation. It's damage per second, after all. The time is just as important in the calculation, and stall units generally find their value by increasing the amount of time your damage units have to deal with enemies. If the enemies take twice as long to move to the blue box, well, you have twice the time to damage them, and basically only need half of the overall DPS. This is a huge part of what makes units like Ascalon so valuable, and it's why things like Mostima S3 still get used in difficult content. When you can slow enemies by 90% or more, you make them take 10 times longer to get to the blue box, and you only need 10% as much DPS to take them out. And Ascalon is a really good example of this, because while her damage is good, it always feels way better than her pure damage numbers would suggest. Because her S2 slows enemies by up to 85.3%, she has 6.8 times as long to deal whatever damage she needs in order to take out an enemy. Slowing an enemy that hard is equivalent to a 6.8 times damage multiplier. And unlike a typical damage multiplier, it doesn't just apply to her own attacks, but to everyone, as everyone now has way longer to burst down the enemy. And it can have some fun interactions with other aspects of kits as well. For example, if enemies are taking that much longer to get where they're going, you also have that much longer for your units to charge their skills. And they're going to take longer before they need to get blocked by your units, potentially helping reduce the healing or survivability needed. So clearly this kind of utility is strong, right? But then, why don't people tend to talk about units like Mostima or Crownslayer in the way they might talk about Silverash or Texalt? Well, the problem that most stall units have is that pretty much no DPS check in casual content really requires this sort of thing. So units that pretty much just bring stalling to the table don't really get much play outside of hardcore content. Ascalon again is one of those units that shakes this sort of thing, because she is good enough at taking advantage of that damage window herself, and doesn't necessarily need you planning out huge burst strats around her skill timings. Not even mentioning her true AoE and multi-hit and really good uptime, making her really valuable in a lot of environments for those features alone. But if most stall units can alter the DPS equation, Tragodia breaks it wide open, and he does that in a couple ways. For one, his pseudo-true damage is enough that it'll feel very impactful in casual content where you're not building a team around trying for some kind of long-term stall. But once you do hit that kind of content, with the right setup he can achieve permanent stalls in a way that no other unit can do. If you've been around the game for a while, you might remember CC12, and the way that the most common max risk strat involved using a combination of ambushers, shifters, and Spectre Altar to basically keep enemies locked in place permanently, using the nearby Originium Altar combined with Spectre's Doll Form AoE to slowly, and I mean slowly, bring them all down. That stall took Mostima, Chalter, Spectre, Manticore, Feeder, and Cliffheart. 6 ops, or half of your entire squad. Tragodia basically brings that down to 1. And okay, for a true perma-stall he needs a bit of support, but he's much more flexible in the kind of support that he needs. Instead of specific shifter setups and worrying about enemy weight and combining that with multiple forms of movement speed reduction, he just needs some SP support and or a bit of extra bind or movement speed reduction. Popular units like Ines, Suzu, and the Sui squad are very good options for this, and options that, unlike the million shifters, you might want to bring anyway, meaning he fits much better into your existing squads, and you no longer need to specifically build your whole team around maintaining a stall. This is nuts. Like, let's look at Ascalon again for a comparison. She slows enemies by 6.8 times, meaning the DPS requirement for them is 6.8 times lower. Tragodia, on the other hand, stops them entirely, potentially forever, making the DPS requirement for them infinitely lower. Yes, infinitely. I cannot stress enough how busted this is. You can go full-on Durin main DPS and still clear some of the hardest DPS checks in the game. Hell, you don't even need that, because his nervous impairment damage will slowly chip them down on its own. So like, not only do you no longer need a million units to do the stalling, you don't even need DPS units to take out the stalled enemies. Like, I wanted to compare this to an infinite duration Mostoma S3, but even when maxed out, even that is only a 99% movement speed reduction and doesn't have elemental damage. And the really wild thing is that he has 2 skills that can do this, one of which has global range. The main distinction for your priorities with this are considering the range in which you need to stall things. If everything you need to stall is in one spot, or one spot at a time, his S2 is perfect. If you need him to stall enemies in a wider area all at once, then bring S3. He is dead ass, maybe the most busted unit that HG has ever released, and in a way I don't really know how they can power creep. Like, Exu and Wishy will eventually have other units that do more damage than them, theoretically anyway. But how do you outdo permanent global stalling? Don't answer that, HG. My pulls are thin enough as is. I don't need you to drop that too. So, Tragodia is busted. And while you may have already heard how busted before this, now you know why. But as I wrap up, I hope you can leave this with a better appreciation of crowd control units as a group. While yes, he is absolutely the best of them at this point, that doesn't invalidate the value that a lot of the others have as well. And if you don't have him specifically, you still have a lot of other options at your disposal, many of whom might already be sitting in your roster, forgotten. Earth Spirit, a 4-star, has an 80% true AoE slow, which again is equivalent to a 5 times damage multiplier. Carnelian S2 is even better, being able to bind enemies in place for its full 25-second duration. Dorothy can bind or slow groups of enemies anywhere on the map on a super short cooldown. All of these units and more can be super valuable ways to get the most out of your DPS units. And I picked these 3 because I have used all 3 of them in contingency contracts. So next time you're stuck, your units just aren't doing enough damage, you don't have enough time to charge your skills, or your blockers just keep getting destroyed the second the enemies arrive, try one of them out and you might be pleasantly surprised. But thanks for watching. I usually focus more on lesser appreciated ops here on my channel, and not like the hot new meta top 3 best units in the game type ops, but there's so much going on with this kit and how he interacts with the game where I thought it'd be really interesting to talk about him. And hey, I managed to do this without taking 50 minutes. Anyway, I have a couple things I'm working on next. Until then, hope you have a great day, and as always, Auf Wiedersehen. Paralysis. Paralysis. See, I can pronounce it right.